Hello, everybody. This is Joe Firestone for Empowering Democracy. And our topic for tonight is Is $1 trillion platinum coin enough? I think that's an interesting question. But before I get to it, okay, if you don't already know or have not already seen, okay, I recommend to everybody that they go take a look at the Duran show today. Okay, the Duran had Scott Ritter on for nearly 3 hours talking about the Ukraine war, talking about where the Ukraine war is likely to go, what the capabilities of the Ukraine army are right now, what the capabilities of the Russian armed forces are now. Also, quite a lot about the intentions of the Russians, what they really might try to do. Hello, Steve. How are you? And hey, Kay, it's good to see you here also. Uh, and that was really it was such a fun show, such a striking show. And uh, it's something everybody should see if they have the view that somehow Ukraine is going to win this war, or somehow the West can bail them out, because that is something that is simply never going to happen, according to Scott Ritter. And he's got, I wouldn't characterize him as really pro-Russian. I think he's telling us the facts on the ground. Steve Wolfrand said Scott is very pro-Russian. I think Scott is very pro-peace. And what he's
I
after
agree with you, Joe.
today is the same thing that he's always been after since we first heard of Scott Ritter. And that is stopping war and I think now it's ending the new Cold War and also disarming the major protagonists in the new Cold War so that we go back from the brink, of nuclear war. That's what Scott is about. Uh, I also think Scott is a very, very loyal American who would lay down his life for the United States in a New York second
I agree.
called for. So I really think it's wrong to say that he is pro-Russian. Yes, he likes Russians.
He knows their language.
He likes the Russian people. He's been a Russian area specialist for a very, very long time. Okay, and his wife is also sympathetic to Russia. She's not a Russian, but she came from one of the USSR republics. She and he live in New York right now. And talk to Jonathan for just a minute and tell him I'm streaming. Okay. Can't talk. Okay, so Steve says I like the Russian people. Yeah, I like the Russian people too.
John? I don't know. I
Okay.
don't know how to get him. John?
But Joe, even without Scott Ritter,
Joe.
when you talk about Russia, Ukraine,
Yeah, we need
you go back many years,
your
and following the history
well, Dad,
led people like myself to question from the start. and to see how
Probably.
Russia, what was going on, and why Russia was pressured into
Oh, really?
what occurred. And Russia had wanted peace all along, but the US media is the one that's been presenting the information from a different stance. It's like they were propagandizing the American people. Oh, I can't hear you, Joe.
Yeah, thanks. I think Scott is okay, a great antidote for the propaganda that we've been getting from our press, okay, our
Yes, he
mainstream.
is.
And in some ways, he, I think he's a better antidote than someone, like Douglas McGregor. Okay, because Douglas McGregor doesn't really talk too much about the cultural end of things.
Right.
He's sort of strictly on the military aspect and on the geopolitical aspect, but he doesn't give you the cultural view. Uh, it's extremely valuable to watch him too because he's very good on the military details. And he was a tank commander, and so he knows an awful lot about that. And of course, the current discussion people are having is, are the tanks really going to do any good or not? And he has a lot to say about that, and he knows an awful lot about that. He's really a tank expert in terms of tank strategy also. So his contributions are very valuable too. I don't mean to say that they're not. Steve Wolprandt is right when he says Russia wanted to join NATO, not just Russia. Under Putin, Russia wanted to join NATO, but were denied, and were denied by the United States, basically. We were responsible for the denial, and we were because we didn't want economic competition with the Union. Uh, I'm sorry, with the Russians in the context of the EU. In other words, we didn't want them meddling in the EU because we were looking out for our economic interests. That's why we excluded them. And that is part of the reason why we've had an ongoing conflict with them for some time. But that's the topic for another show. And I do have to get to the topic, okay, of this evening, which is $1 trillion platinum coin enough? So why do I think there might be a little problem here? Well, to see why, we have to look at the daily treasury statement. I am going to bring that up. Where is it? I know I've got it down here. Where is it? Here it is. At first it wasn't showing, but now it is. Okay, can you see it, Dee?
Yes.
Okay, great. That's great. Okay, let's look at a number of key things here just to see what is going on. Okay, I'm going to highlight, first of all, okay, this is as of January 30th. This is the daily Treasury statement one day ago. I don't think today's daily Treasury statement, which would be the closing of the first quarter, okay, is out yet. So let me see something here. Here we go. Oh. Trying to get my highlighter working. So the opening balance for today was 567,827,000,000. The opening balance for the fiscal year was 635,994,000,000. So not much different. The opening balance for this month was 446,600,085. Now, total Treasury General Account deposits. This is a summary table. It came from Table 2. So, for today, there were deposits of 27,489,000,000. For this month, there were deposits of 1,935,796,000,000. For this fiscal year, there were deposits of 7,403,478,000,000. And the withdrawals were, in other words, the spending was 15,490,000,000. This month was 1,802,655,000,000. And for the fiscal year, and remember the fiscal year 23 started on October 1st. So we're just ending the 4th month of the fiscal year. So the fiscal year to date, our deposits have been 7,403,478,000,000, and I wanted to highlight that because that's 1/3 of the fiscal year. If we project to the other 2/3 of the fiscal year, we'd be looking at total deposits of roughly $22 trillion and total withdrawals of a little more than $22 trillion, roughly, I don't know, about 150 billion more or something like that. Now, one might wonder, how can there be all those deposits when the tax deposits, as we'll see later, are so much less? And the reason, of course, is that we are rolling over debt continuously. And the tax deposits, of course, we know taxes don't pay for anything, but they do trigger the marking up of the Treasury account by the Federal Reserve. And so we can see that that's likely to be only a fraction of the 7,459,545,000,000 we see in spending. Okay, the closing balance for this fiscal year was 579,826,000,000. That's the closing balance in the Treasury General Account. Okay, the closing balance, of course, is identical to this month's balance. And today, the closing balance was also 579,826,000,000. So that's what the Treasury General account now has in it for spending. Okay. Let me highlight the end result of that, okay, as well. Table 2 deals with the deposits and withdrawals of operating cash. And you can see it's broken down into all the categories, okay, of spending. And it deals with deposits and withdrawals of operating cash. So this is like the master table. We can see that Social Security benefits and payments for the fiscal year to date have already been 377,369,000,000. Remember, the fiscal year started October 1st. We're about a third of the way through. So the Social Security benefits and payments this year, if things run at the same rate, which they mostly do with Social Security, we are going to be over $1 trillion in Social Security benefits payments for the year. So that is one significant fact that you might be interested in. Table 3A is public debt transactions. It's really interesting to notice that today's redemptions of debt, of U.S. debt, I should say the debt subject to the limit, because that's what is recorded here. It's 436,397,000,000. 436 billion redeemed in one day. I can tell you from looking at past years and past days that that's not far from the average per day. 436 billion is not particularly high. It's like an average redemption. The fiscal year to date shows redemptions of 50 trillion, 643,371,000,000. Notice here that for the month, the redemptions were at 11,353,500,000,000. $11 trillion of the debt was paid back in 1 month. 50 trillion of it was paid back in 4 months. Now the total debt is right now 31.4 trillion. So obviously those redemptions were caused by rolling of debt. Some of the debts were paid off. New debts were incurred because new securities were sold. This takes place throughout the whole year. It's a steady process. Just as collecting tax revenues is also steady throughout the whole year. Now, some days it's heavier than others and so on. But what I'm talking about is these are continuous processes. The net change in public debt outstanding in the fiscal year to date, the debt increased by 526 billion, 991 million. Okay. Now, today, the net change, in the public debt was to reduce it by 1,344 million. But this month to date, the debt increased by 36,213. And for the fiscal year to date, we've already incurred, after only 4 months, 526,991 million. If the rest of the year is like it's been so far, our debt will have increased by $1.5 trillion. Probably by another trillion is likely. We have 8 more months left in the fiscal year. That may increase our outstanding public debt subject to the limit by another $1 trillion. Now notice that I'm just remarking on the facts here. I'm not saying that is bad, because I know that if our debt increases by $1.5 trillion for the whole year, that means the net financial assets of the private sector and the rest of the world in the form of U.S. debt will have increased by $1.5 trillion. And much of that, probably most of it, will go to the private sector here in the United States. And so that means the private sector, of which we are all a part, will be 1.5, well, let's say $1.2 trillion more prosperous, at least in terms of addition of net financial assets. Okay, now if we project an increase in debt of $1 trillion for the rest of the year, then obviously our debt by the end of this fiscal year is going to be roughly $33 trillion. Now, we are supposedly right at the debt ceiling. If we use the $1 trillion platinum coin to pay down the debt, then we would be looking at $1 trillion worth of space for future net spending for the other 8 months of the year. That spending, that likely spending, would be pretty much covered, obviously, by the platinum coin. Because once you use the proceeds from the platinum coin to pay down the debt, then there's $1 trillion of space for issuing more debt before the debt ceiling is hit once again. which it would be roughly by the end of the year. In other words, the $1 trillion coin would probably carry us to the end of the year, and we'd be looking to a new debt ceiling crisis at the end of the year. So I raise the question, is $1 trillion enough? People have been talking as if they mint a $1 trillion coin, that's going to solve debt ceiling crises for good. They're talking like that. They're not necessarily explicitly saying it, but they're saying, boy, it would be an easy solution to the problem of the Republicans having debt ceiling crises by issuing a $1 trillion coin. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's not true. That is not true. The 1 trillion isn't going to automatically cover the projected shortfall. By the way, we may wish to spend more than 1 trillion for the remainder of the year. We may have a deficit larger than that. If the economy starts to slow down and the automatic stabilizers are activated once again, because they are when things slow down and a recession comes into view, then we may have more than $1 trillion of debt that we will wish to issue before the end of the year. If that's the case, as we approach the end of the year, we might be paralyzed by another debt ceiling crisis. Of course, then we could always mint a second $1 trillion coin. But why do that? Why play with using debt instruments at all? Why don't we just mint a coin whose denomination is large enough that we can pay off the outstanding debt and have enough money left over to pay for more net spending? In fact, why not do a coin that is large enough that we don't have to worry about debt ceiling crises for a generation? How about that? Surely within that sort of time frame, we would be able to get the Congress to repeal the debt limit legislation and all debt ceilings completely. Or maybe we would simply decide that it is not in the interest of the government to have to worry about the debt instruments at all. The Biden administration can do that if instead of minting a $1 trillion coin, he mints a $100 trillion coin, or even a quadrillion dollar coin. Why would we want to do that? because we really do not want, in my view, to have people terrorizing us by talking to us about how much we as a government owe. We don't want to have these news articles that say, for example, your share of the national debt is $85,000. Every American share of the national debt is $85,000. Our children, our grandchildren are going to have to pay that back. As long as we have large national debts, we're going to hear that. Now, my MMT colleagues will rightly tell you that someday we will be able to teach people that the size of the debt does not matter because we're a currency sovereign. And the size of the debt to GDP ratio also doesn't matter for all kinds of reasons, okay, including the fact that the debt to GDP ratio is the wrong ratio to focus on anyway. Okay, I think all that is true, and we might be able to educate people to that eventually either. But I personally have been trying to educate people to those truths since 2010. And I've been joined by a lot of other MMTers more and more every year trying to teach that to the public. And yet, we still have this propaganda coming from the austerity mongers and coming from the administration that keeps on telling us that all that debt we have does matter, that the debt to GDP ratio does matter, and that we have to have austerity in federal spending to lower that debt and to lower our deficits. Now, more and more people are beginning to believe that this is BS and those things don't matter. But we have crises to face right now. We have the climate emergency, most importantly. We have lesser emergencies that are very, very important that we have to handle that will take a lot of spending. Why is it politically advantageous to us to grapple with the Austerians every single year and have a bunch of ignorant or worse, reprehensible people lying to us about the idea that the national debt subject to the limit actually matters? Why do we have to waste our political energy to fight those battles? And we're fighting those battles now in Congress. We have Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema and the whole Republican Party telling us that debts matter, that our debt matters, that it's too high, and that it's a reason why we can't have nice things. And they're going to go along, they're going to spout that stuff to the public for the next 2 years, and 2024 election is going to come around, and they'll still be running on the idea that we have too much debt and too many people out there will vote for Republicans because they will view the Republicans as the fiscally responsible party. I mean, these are political issues. They are still political issues. In my view, it's rather irrelevant from the political point of view that the size of the debt doesn't matter for a currency sovereign like ourselves, and that the debt to GDP ratio doesn't matter for a currency sovereign like ourselves. That seems to be irrelevant from a political point of view. But what if we could say to them, our national debt is in the process of being paid off, and that our short-term debt will be paid off over 6 months in huge quantity, all the short-term debt of the United States would be paid off certainly within the first year. There would be a monstrous reduction in the public debt because we used a $100 trillion platinum coin and paid off a good portion of it as it fell due, and stood ready to pay off the rest of it, and also to cover all the deficits for the next 10 to 15 years. What if we could tell, we being the progressives, what if we could tell the Austerians that? What if we could tell them to go fly a kite, because there is no reason for austerity, and if you doubt that there's a reason for austerity, look at the daily Treasury statement and look at the balance in the Treasury General account. And look at that huge balance, which dwarfs how much money we'll have to repay this year and how much money we'll have to spend on programs, how much net spending we'll have to do this year on all our programs and the other programs that people say they're refusing to pass because they're worried about the size of the debt. What if we could tell people that? And we could refer them to the daily Treasury statement, or we could refer them to CBO, or we could refer them to other sources that record what's in the Treasury General account as we go along each year and at the end of each year. What if we could point to that? And what if we could point to the reduction in debt and the huge increase in the debt to GDP ratio every single year until all that debt is paid off? We're not going to pay it off all at once because that would be inflationary. But we can pay it off as it falls due without having any inflation as a result of that payoff, of debt. So why aren't we angry at the Biden administration for not minting that $100 trillion coin tomorrow? Why aren't we out there in front of the White House with millions and millions of people shouting for the $100 trillion coin to disarm the Austerians and to change our politics, because we remove the basis of Austerian policy and Austerian propaganda by getting rid of huge quantities of the national debt almost immediately, Why aren't we out there protesting for that? Why don't we stay in the streets until we get that $100 trillion coin minted? I don't understand that. Of course, I consider myself a modern money theory supporter, okay, and partisan. I certainly am one. But there's a political side to this. And MMT people can disagree about the political side of this. Lots of MMTers are advocating for the $1 trillion coin. I am advocating for the $100 trillion coin, not for the $1 trillion coin. The reason why I differ from the people advocating for the $1 trillion coin is because my political views about the impact of various denomination coins are different from their views concerning the impact. I don't have economic differences with them. I don't have fiscal differences with them. But I have political differences with them that tell me that the right move right now is the $100 trillion coin, or a coin that has even larger denominations than that. And I think they're making a big mistake in continuing to advocate only for the $1 trillion coin. They're being politically too conservative. They're too concerned about what people might say about them. They're too concerned about the negative press crap they might get if they came out and said, let's just end all this debt nonsense and all this debt ceiling nonsense, and let's mint the $100 trillion coin. So people will never again say that the United States is limited in its fiscal spending capacity. Now, my colleagues have no trouble arguing the theory of monetary sovereignty or currency sovereignty. They know very well that provided the laws don't change on us, that we won't have any debt problems or debt ceiling problems or any other problems from the economic or fiscal point of view. But obviously, even after 12 years of teaching this since I got involved, going into our 13th year of teaching since I got involved, and some of them have been teaching this for 25 years, 27 years, and it's still not commonly accepted knowledge. Well, I say teaching is great, and teaching it correctly in the long term is even greater, and we got to keep on teaching it. But I also say one profound demonstration is worth many years of teaching, and the demonstration that the federal government can create nearly $100 trillion in the Treasury spending account in just a few days. That demonstration will do more than many years of teaching to get people to believe that the federal government creates its own money and that the private sector is not the source, okay, of money. That contrary to Margaret Thatcher, contrary to Ronald Reagan, there is such a thing as public money. And it can be created in the Treasury General account in just a few days to whatever extent we wish. It can be $100 trillion, it can be $1 quadrillion. We need to teach. There is never a shortage of money. It's all about the impact of the money spent. It's all about what it does. It's not about the ability of the federal government to create it. There is public money. There is money that is created by the federal government under the authority of the Constitution, which has its authority in the power of the people. We need to use that authority for the public good. We need to use that money for the public purpose. And we need to do it right now. Because politically, that would be devastating to Republican attempts to continue to fool the public and to attempts also by many Democrats and many third parties to fool the public about the nature of public funding and what it can do. That is why this is so important. That is why we need the $100 trillion coin or coins of such a magnitude. $1 trillion coin won't do it for us because it won't make that demonstration. In other words, they'll pay off $1 trillion worth of debt, and then guess what? They'll go back to issuing debt instruments in order to put money in the Treasury General account to keep the government operating. They'll go right back to it. And the point will not be made. People will soon forget that $1 trillion coin was minted. The Republicans will still terrorize the deficit. They'll still talk about all we owe and have to pay it back. And they'll still lie about us having to pay it back through taxes. So let's get rid of this part of the conflict. Let Biden do it by minting the $100 trillion coin. He's now worried about whether he can win in 2024 or he can't win in 2024. He's claiming that he ought to be able to win because look at all he's done for people. At the level of the people, we don't feel that way. And I'm not just speaking for myself when I say that. I am not just speaking for myself. So I'm now going to take your comments. I'm going to have to get rid of that, kick it out. There we go. So I'm back. Okay, folks, comments. I'm going to skip the greetings unless they're particularly humorous. Kay says they're cutting my food stamps next month, but I can't find out how much. I hate Ohio. They're covering food stamps because of the austerity mongers in Congress. Because the Republicans decide they don't want to continue funding the food stamps, and a few Democrats join them. And so you can't get the extension of the food stamp program passed. And how do they justify they're doing it? How do they justify cutting the food stamps?
No idea. It's kind of like we don't care if people eat.
It's we don't care if people eat, but they justify it by saying we can't afford the programs, don't they?
Right. Somehow they have money for other things.
It's an austerity justification. It's what I've been saying.
Exactly.
It's there now. Kay's food stamps will be getting cut, and my neighbor's food stamps here will be getting cut because the Republicans keep on propagandizing austerity and the importance of cutting the deficit. Steve says, what's a few trillion between friends? Kay says, so am I. D. Steve Wolfbrand says, don't give Biden that coin. He will forget where he put it. It's going to end up in the vault at the Federal Reserve, Steve. Biden won't have anything to do with it. I know you were kidding, but I'm explaining the process. It gets deposited in the Mint's account at the Federal Reserve. The seigniorage is swept from that account into the Treasury General account. The coin itself is accepted by the Federal Reserve because it must accept it. If you doubt that, I'll go into why it must accept it, but believe me, it must accept it for very good reasons. When it accepts it, that coin goes into the vault at the Federal Reserve, and it sits there. It sits there for as long as there is a vault in the Federal Reserve. Steve keeps kidding. Steve Wolfbrand, can you make change with that coin at 7-Eleven? No. But what can happen is, of course, the Fed takes the reserves that coin is generating. It replaces the $100 trillion coin with $100 trillion in reserves. And then the federal government starts spending out of those reserves. And when you get some of that money wired into your personal account, you can get a bunch of dollars and make change at 7-Eleven if you want to make change. or you can ask your bank to cash a check of yours and get change in return for that check. Steve says Doc should be in charge of our economy. Kay says, yes, Steve. Steve says he's very arrogant. Me? I'm arrogant? And Dee says, Greg isn't feeling well tonight. Yes, Greg isn't able to be here tonight. Steve Wolfman says, Coven? Coven? Is that? Greg was working outside in the rain yesterday. He had a sore throat and headache today. Yes, and he's resting up. That's what's going on. Kay says, hope he's better soon. Steve Wolfman says, bedtime. Kay Ryan says, I know.
The second work.
I'm sorry, say that again, please.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Somebody in the background here.
Oh, okay. Kay says, I know, Joe. And Kay says, night, Steve. And Kay says, night again. Okay, any more questions or comments? I still got a couple of minutes. I was really serious when I said we really need to get out there in front of the White House and we need to have a continuing protest for the $100 trillion coin. That's not going to change my ideas that we have to replace our Congress entirely. We have to do that too. But believe me, it would greatly improve the political situation if the Republicans could no longer talk about, we owe $31.4 trillion in debt. How are you going to pay that? That's $85,000 for each of you. Each of
I
you.
know. I'm so tired of hearing that.
Each of yins. Whatever accent they use and whatever tone they use. I'm real tired of hearing that. It would be worth minting the $100 trillion coins so that we wouldn't have to hear that BS anymore. I mean, that alone would make it worthwhile, apart from all the other advantages, like the fact that it would free up enough money that we could go to Congress and lobby Congress to pay for the Green New Deal. By the way, a more sumptuous Green New Deal than even that was advocated by Bernie Sanders in the 2020 election. His was only something like 16.2 trillion. We can recast our whole society with that money. Once it's in the Treasury General account, Congress is going to have to scramble a lot to say they can't afford this or that, okay, or the other thing. And that too would help us in getting rid of those who don't want to make America a great place to live.
No more.
No more. We've had enough of that. And the $100 trillion coin would free us from all that. So when people tell you it should just be $1 trillion coin because that's what they're likely to agree to politically, screw what they're likely to agree to politically. We need to demand that they mint the kind of coin we need to get that money into the Treasury General account. We need a visible symbol of the fiscal competency of the federal government. And that symbol will be the money that's in the Treasury General account. That's why we need a case says USA has failed in too many ways. Well, brace yourself, Kay, because the US is about to fail in even more ways. But one thing we can succeed at, if we press hard enough, is getting Biden to mint that $100 trillion coin. For his own political good, he ought to mint it.
Yeah, going down in history.
And on that note, I'm going to say good night.
Thank you
I'll
for
be
having
back
me, Joe.
tomorrow with another Dump the Corruption fundraising program. We're going through the 95 people in the Congressional Progressive Caucus very quickly now because Greg is doing it along with me. And sometimes Dump the Corruption even gets into around the world with Brandy and Dee.
Yes, it does.
And so we're working hard towards that. And I'll have another program about that tomorrow.
Well, happy to be here, Joe.
And I'm so happy that you were able to join me, Dee.
Thank you.
Good night, Cora. Okay, I'm glad you could come. I'm very sorry that Greg was not able to make it, but he did the right thing. He needs to get well quickly.
Yes. Yes, he does.
Okay, so good night, everyone, and have a
Yes.
wonderful night. And thank you for coming.
Right.